case of Etan Patz, a haunting mystery that changed America. Etan Patz was born on October 9, 1972, and lived with his family in New York City. Raised by his father, Stan, an accomplished photographer, and his mother, Julie, a dedicated childcare worker, Etan grew up in a modest apartment at 113 Prince Street, located in the artistic Soho neighborhood of Lower Manhattan. He had two siblings, an older sister and a younger brother. In May 1979, 6-year-old Etan was finishing first grade. His daily school bus stop was just 2 blocks away at the corner of West Broadway and Prince Street. Eager for a small taste of independence, Etan asked his mother if he could walk to the bus stop alone. After some thought, Julie agreed, unaware that this simple decision would mark the beginning of one of the most infamous missing child cases in U.S. history. The day Etan disappeared. On the morning of May 25, 1979, Etan left his home at approximately 7:55 a.m. It was to be his first time walking to the bus stop alone. Along the way, he planned to stop at a neighborhood bodega to buy a soda, something he looked forward to enjoying during lunch at school. The plan was for a family friend to escort him home later that afternoon at 3:30 p.m. But Etan never made it to school, and he never returned home. Julie called the friend, only to learn that Etan hadn't been on the bus that morning. None of the other parents or children at the stop had seen him. Panic set in. Julie called her husband, then the police. What followed was one of the largest missing child searches New York City had ever seen. Authorities scoured buildings, basements, alleyways, elevator shafts, rooftops, and dumpsters. Despite the massive effort, no trace of Etan or any evidence connected to his disappearance was found. His case quickly drew national attention. Etan Patz became one of the first missing children to appear on a milk carton, a haunting symbol of the vulnerability of children and the anxiety gripping American families. The investigation begins. 2 months later, in July 1979, police interviewed employees at the bodega near Etan's bus stop. One of those employees was Pedro Hernandez, an 18-year-old stock clerk. At the time, Pedro raised no red flags, and police moved on to other leads. Hernandez eventually relocated to New Jersey, working construction until a serious injury sidelined him. Meanwhile, the investigation continued. In March 1982, another potential suspect emerged. Jose Ramos, a man arrested after luring 2 young boys into a drainpipe. Ramos had previously dated Etan's babysitter, and a search of his home turned up photographs of young boys, one of whom resembled Etan. In 1987, Ramos was convicted on unrelated charges, though he remained a suspect in Etan's case. Ramos's name surfaced again in 1988, when Etan's babysitter's son accused him of sexual abuse. In a 1991 FBI interview, Ramos admitted to assaulting a child on the very day Etan disappeared and claimed he later placed the boy on a subway. Though this seemed suspiciously close to Etan's timeline, prosecutors never charged Ramos in connection to the case. The investigation slowed and eventually went cold. A break in the case or a misstep? In 2012, detectives focused on a new figure, a carpenter named Othniel Miller, who kept a workshop between Etan's home and his bus stop. Police learned that the night before Etan disappeared, Miller had spent 45 minutes alone with him in the basement. Cadaver dogs later detected the scent of human decomposition in the workshop. When questioned, Miller said, "What if the body was moved?" A chilling comment. Still, authorities never charged him. Then came a stunning development. Jose Lopez, the brother-in-law of Pedro Hernandez, contacted police after watching media coverage of the investigation. He claimed Pedro had confessed to killing a child decades earlier. On May 23, 2012, police brought Pedro in for questioning at his home in Maple Shade, New Jersey. Pedro was now middle-aged, unemployed, and living with his second wife. He agreed to talk with investigators, who transported him to the Camden County Prosecutor's office. Notably, the initial interview was not video recorded, despite a functioning camera in the room. First, Pedro believed he was being questioned about child support. But when police revealed that the case was about a missing child, the tone shifted. As the interrogation intensified, Pedro asked to leave multiple times. He was told he could, but only after answering a few more questions. Eventually, Pedro broke down. He curled up in the fetal position on the floor, sobbing. Police then introduced the idea that abuse in Pedro's childhood might explain any violent behavior. They implied he could confess without full blame. Whether manipulated or mentally overwhelmed, Pedro finally said, "I did it." He claimed he saw Etan standing outside the bodega, invited him inside for a soda, then strangled him, placed his body in a garbage bag, and left it in a box around the corner. Worried that the confession might be inadmissible due to a lack of Miranda warnings, officers read him his rights after the fact and restarted the recording. Pedro repeated his confession, though with discrepancies. He confessed again at the Manhattan District Attorney's office. Still, inconsistencies persisted. Trial, mental health, and controversy. Pedro Hernandez was arrested and charged with second-degree murder, felony murder, and kidnapping. Before trial, he underwent extensive mental health evaluations. Diagnoses ranged from schizotypal personality disorder, marked by magical thinking and paranoia, to schizophrenia. His IQ was estimated between 67 and 76, placing him in the bottom 2% of the population. Pedro's first trial began in January 2015. After 18 days of deliberation, the jury was deadlocked. A mistrial was declared. His second trial began in 2016. During deliberations, jurors asked the judge whether they could disregard Pedro's later confessions if they found the first, pre-Miranda, one was involuntary. The judge incorrectly said no, they didn't have to disregard the later confessions. 7 days later, on February 14, 2017, the jury found Pedro guilty of felony murder and kidnapping, but not of intentional murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. But on July 21, 2025, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals overturned the conviction. They ruled the judge's response to the jury was legally incorrect. Now, Pedro Hernandez faces either a retrial or release. My analysis: Pedro Hernandez has always maintained his innocence, and he has many supporters who argue he was railroaded. They see his confession as the product of coercion, mental illness, and desperation. They question how the state could pursue a conviction without a single piece of physical evidence. No DNA, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses. Prosecutors, however, stand by the confession. They argue that Pedro confessed multiple times to various individuals over the years, including a church retreat attendee, a neighbor, and both of his wives. Still, each of those accounts differed dramatically in detail, from stabbing a child with a stick to strangling a teenager. The confession Pedro gave to police was also full of contradictions. In one version, he said others were present during the murder, some in nightgowns. In another, he never saw the victim's face, but still identified Etan from a photo. He also claimed the murder happened in the bodega basement, despite that space being locked and inaccessible to employees like him. The police manipulated a man with a long history of mental illness and cognitive limitations into confessing, all while violating basic constitutional protections. They never read Pedro his rights until after his confession, and only then started recording. This is not just poor policing, it's systemic failure. So, was Pedro guilty? Honestly, there's no way to know. The only evidence is his unreliable confession. In my opinion, that's not enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Etan Patz deserved justice. But justice should never be built on questionable tactics and forced confessions. This case is a tragic reminder of how deeply flawed our criminal justice system can be, especially when it comes to vulnerable individuals. Pedro Hernandez may have killed Etan Patz, or he may have been a scapegoat for a system desperate to close a case. Either way, 13 years of his life have been lost, and we still don't have the truth.